Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to part of the St. Augustine Historical Society Speakers Series for Fall 2020 and Winter 21. My name is Charles Tingley, and the topic of my talk today is Alexander H. Darnes, MD, A Life Rediscovered. I'm the Senior Research Librarian for the St. Augustine Historical Society and has worked for the Historical Society since 1994. Now, Mariah Kirby Smith, the great-granddaughter of General Edmund Kirby Smith, who was born in the house that now serves as our research library, came to the Historical Society in the early 2000s with an idea of creating a memorial to what her great-grandfather did with the second half of his life. He is generally remembered for what he did during the Civil War, but the family emphatically wanted to do something to commemorate his career at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, at his birthplace. And this was to be funded by her mother, Mrs. Edmund Kirby Smith III. Now, when she approached Chairine Rodriguez Botti, the executive director of the Historical Society at the time, she suggested that, I think it would make a better composition if we included Alec, the general's enslaved valet. And Chairine and I looked at each other and said, who's Alex? Now, the Kirby Smith family generally only knows Alex from a little booklet that Mrs. Edmund Kirby Smith, the general's wife, Cassandra, published. It's called All's Fair in Love and War, or How a Southern Belle Won a Confederate Colonel. Well, in that little booklet, Cassie Kirby Smith uses Alec, the valet, as kind of comic relief. So we weren't too sure that this guy named Alec would be appropriate for a memorial to General Edmund Kirby Smith. So I was charged with researching more about the mysterious Alec. Well, this led me on a 12-year odyssey. At first, we were able to find enough pertinent material about Alec in the Kirby Smith papers, which luckily we already have on microfilm at the research library, to determine that, hey, this guy was interesting in his own life. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is what was interesting about the life of Alec. Here is Mariah Kirby Smith working on the clay model that was eventually cast in bronze and is now at the garden of the Segee Kirby Smith House. It was dedicated in 2003. And here is a photograph that I was lucky to get from Dr. Darnes' great-nephew, David Earle. Now, in setting up a medical practice in Jacksonville in 1880, Dr. Darnes became the first African-American to have a medical practice in Jacksonville. Now, there were 3 other black doctors who briefly practiced medicine in Florida, but they were all Army officers during the Civil War. He set up a genuine medical practice. Now, his mother was Violet Pinckney, born in Charleston, died in Jacksonville, and she's sometimes known as Violet Fane. Slaves frequently went by different names during their lives, depending on whether they used their parents' names or their master's name or a combination of several masters. So it is not unusual for an African American in the mid-19th century to go by several different names over their lives. Now, she originally enters the picture as an enslaved servant of Lieutenant Ephraim Kirby Smith. This was Edmund Kirby Smith's much older brother. And he was stationed in Florida during the Second Seminole War. But when he left Florida to be reassigned to Fort Winnebago in today's Portage, Wisconsin, he left Violet behind. Now, the question is, was she already pregnant? And this is what the house where Violet gave birth to Alexander looked like when the Smiths lived there. This is the garden facade. It has changed quite a bit since that time due to some remodeling in the 1880s. Now, I say, was she already pregnant? There's a lot of mystery about when exactly Alexander Darnes was born. Just about every document that gives his age, from the various censuses to the obituary that ran in the newspaper when he died in 1894, they all give different dates. The earliest reference to an actual age for him is in the 1850 slave schedule for St. Augustine. There is one black boy in the Smith household, and he's 10 years old. So that would make him old enough to be the child of Ephraim Kirby Smith. But starting in 1842, if one of the other dates is correct, there was a young lieutenant stationed near St. Augustine who, at the very least, gave Darnes his name. This is Alexander Conti Hanson Darn, born in Maryland, in Darnesville, Maryland, just outside of the District of Columbia. Now, he leaves the Army at the end of the Second Seminole War and is completely out of the picture from then on, but that's his headstone in Fairfax County, Virginia. The earliest reference we have to Alec is a letter by Joseph Lee Smith writing to his son, Edmund Kirby Smith, at West Point. And this mention says, "Your servant boy Alec thrives rapidly and will be a useful waiter for you in a year or two when you graduate." Now, Edmund Kirby Smith graduates in 1847. So, 1846. So some of the later dates that are given, like in his obituary, are all after this date, so they can't be right. And a lot of speculation has been made as to whether there's a biological connection between the Smith family and Alexander Hanson Darnes. Both his great-great-nephews and people in the Kirby Smith family think that there is. But we're very lucky in that when Edmund Kirby Smith died in 1893, he wrote several letters to his widow, Cassie, and Cassie asked him to explain his life with the general in a long letter. And that's a 17-page letter. And so he says, you know, he was brought up by Frances Kirby Smith, who was as kind to me as she could be. You read into that what you want. And as I said, some people have speculated that there is a biological connection based on the resemblance of these men. So there is Edmund Kirby Smith on the left and Dr. Darnes on the right. I don't draw any conclusions, but you make your own decision. Now, there has been some new information provided me since I did this initial amount of research, which culminated in an article in the winter 2016 Florida Historical Quarterly. And this new information comes from previously unavailable pay vouchers for Army servants. By using these pay vouchers, you can track the movements of officers and their servants almost month by month, because they had to put in vouchers to receive the allotment of pay that they were allowed from the federal government to hire servants or provide clothing for their servants. And so from this, we know that Edmund Kirby Smith took a slave, Alexander, to Mexico in 1847. Now, even if we take the earliest possible date for Dr. Darnes's birth, this would mean he was 6 or 7. Now, we may find this very unusual today, but it was not that uncommon in the 19th century to have young boys as servants. These kids were basically shining your boots and keeping your swords clean and feeding the horses and all that sort of stuff. So having a young boy as your valet or stable boy was not that unusual. And this is what one of those pay vouchers looked like. And I'm very thankful for the research provided to me by Walt Bachman, who has extensively researched this subject of Army servants. And here's a close-up of how the form was filled out for Alexander Nigro, Edmund Kirby Smith's servant. Then later in the 1850s, they go to West Point. Briefly, Edmund Kirby Smith taught at West Point. And so here's for June of 1851, the pay voucher. And you can see he got $30 that month for himself, and $7 for a private servant, and $2.50 allowance for the servants, and $6 for sustenance for the servant. So the Army provided officers with this money. It was essentially half of the salary of an Army private. And depending on your rank, you were allotted so many servants. Captains or lieutenants could have 1, and generals could have 5, paid for by the Army. And now he also took Alexander on the Mexican border expedition in 1855. This expedition set the new boundary between Mexico and the United States after the Mexican-American War. And that pile of rocks in the foreground of this image was done for the expedition's report, shows one of the places that they were marking along the boundary. And here we have the allowance for 91 days on that expedition. Smith got a total of $380.70, and $197.20 was to pay for the private servant. So, the Army's pretty good record keepers. Now, in 1856, at this time, Edmund Kirby Smith was stationed with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry at Fort Mason, Texas. And Alec was his valet there, and the Texas Parks Department has reconstructed what the headquarters would have looked like. So this is the building that Smith and Alex would have lived in when they were out on the Texas border fighting with Comanches and Cherokees to try to stabilize the border between the settlements in Texas and Indian Territory. Then they were moved to a station called Camp Colorado. Yes, there is a Colorado River in Texas as well as the one in Arizona. This also is a reconstruction of what the headquarters building, which would have had officers' housing in it, looked like. And in Alex's long letter describing his activities, he says, when he, Edmund Kirby Smith, first returned to his command, and I was with him, the sight of the soldiers and their equipments and their horses were grand to me in every respect. I had never seen anything like it before, and I was delighted with everything. I took care of his quarters, kept them clean and in order as a duty. And believe it or not, personally, I think the Smith family must have been hoarders, because so much of their papers and their artifacts have survived. So here's Alex writing, I took special pride in keeping his sword, his shoes, and equipment bright and in good order. And here's the actual trunk that Alex would have put all that accoutrement into. It's in the Smithsonian. And there's one of Edmund Kirby Smith's swords. Now, at the outbreak of the Civil War, Smith cast his lot with his native state of Florida and becomes a colonel in the Confederate Army and takes Alex with him. So one of the unusual things about that long account that Alex gives is most of the accounts by blacks of the Civil War are written by newspaper men who interview a black who was lived during the Civil War. The unusual thing about Alex's account is he wrote it himself, and he's an educated man, and we'll go into that in a minute. So he is probably the only black man who describes the First Battle of Bull Run by saying, I was on the battlefields with him at the first Bull Run battle on Sunday, July 21st. Saw both armies at the point in the field and saw the men firing at each other, but the firing got so hot and heavy that I took to a fence for protection. And as soon as convenient, I got back to the rear. You can imagine, he was only a teenager at the time. And here is an image from Harper's Magazine of removing the dead from the battlefield. And Alex continues, I was shown where he, Edmund Kirby Smith, was by one of his staff officers. I saw him lying on a bed on the floor, and he appeared to be unconscious with a severe wound. I did not feel so bad after seeing that he was living as I did before. I had been told at General J.E. Johnston's headquarters that he had been killed on the field, and I saw them bring General B from the field dead. He was killed. I knew that they had been near each other. When I saw this, I broke down completely. Now, recuperating from a severe arm injury, Edmund Kirby Smith was taken to Lynchburg, Virginia, and this is where he meets Cassie Selden. And after a very brief courtship, they're married. Now, Cassie writes in her little booklet that Alex was extremely jealous of her at first. So the situation was tense in the Smith household for a while. Later on, he has various places that they go to. They are in campaigns in Kentucky and Tennessee, and but at the end of the Civil War, Edmund Kirby Smith is in charge of all Confederate forces west of the Mississippi, with headquarters in Shreveport, Louisiana. And this is another really unusual thing about Darnes's account, is that he actually leaves an account of the last days of the Confederacy. Now comes a change in things, conditions in which separated us, he and Kirby Smith, for the first time at any length. He left Shreveport, and as soon as it was known by the soldiers that he had gone, it looked like it was every man of them was looking out for himself and taking everything they could lay their hands on. The Union forces had not occupied the city yet. It was very chaotic, and when the Union forces arrived, Alex discovers someone who he had known in the Union Army, who gets him transported to New Orleans. And he has the general's equipment and horses in his possession. Unluckily, he puts the general's horses on one steamship, which sinks in the Red River, and so the horses are lost. But Alex manages to get a steamship from the port of New Orleans back to Fortress Monroe in Virginia with the general's equipment intact, that chest we saw in an earlier slide. Alex did have his own possessions stolen, though. Now, one of the people that's very important in Alexander Darnes's life is Frances Smith Webster. She is the wife of Lucian Webster, another Army officer, and the sister to Ephraim and Edmund Kirby Smith. And in that long letter, Darnes thanked her, saying that she was a Christian spirited lady who pitied the unfortunate condition of this, meaning African American, part of humanity. Now, Frances Smith Webster was a Union sympathizer. She lived either in York, Pennsylvania, or Baltimore during the war, and afterwards she varied those two different locations as her residence. And Alex remains with these Smith family under their employ until 1867. And here are a few quotes that we have from Frances Smith Webster. "We have seen Alex 2 or 3 times. He is perfectly faithful and devoted to you. He begged me to say to you that he hoped that you would come soon." Edmund Kirby Smith, after he got his parole was found that he wasn't going to be arrested and sent to prison as a commander of a Confederate army, was busy looking for a job for himself to support his growing family. Smith eventually has 11 children. He only had 3 by then. The last reference we have until the time of Edmund Kirby Smith's death is a letter that Frances Kirby Smith, Mother Smith, writes to Edmund Kirby Smith in April of 1866. Alex has had bad colds, seems very sad and dejected to be parting with us, seems to cling to us as one of us. Now, as I said, a lot has been talked about as to whether Alex is biologically a Smith or not. He was certainly very affectionate towards the Smith family. Was he suffering from Stockholm Syndrome? Oh, we will never know. All I can go by is his words and the words of others describing this relationship. Now, where Smith was going to was he briefly held some other jobs, probably in Baltimore, and then he started attending the preparatory division of Lincoln University in 1870. He received his bachelor's degree from Lincoln in 1876 and his master's degree in 1880. Lincoln was a very small, all-male institution at that time. Lincoln University prides itself in being the oldest institution of higher education for Africans in the world. That may be stretching it, but that's what they say. And it has several distinguished alumni, including Thurgood Marshall and Langston Hughes. So while Darnes is at Lincoln, he participates in a legal case regarding voter suppression. So this is Darnes fighting for his new rights under the 15th Amendment as to being equal to any man in the United States. So there were 25 defendants in this case, and the issue was whether students at the school were in fact residents of Lower Oxford Township and eligible to vote. The court ruled that 10 students, including Darnes, were eligible to vote because they had no other domicile. And the vote of those 10 students actually did change a couple of the local races that year. Well, after Lincoln, Darnes goes on to Howard University Medical School. Now, up until the 1960s, 95% of all African American physicians in the United States either attended Howard University Medical School or Mahaney Medical College in Tennessee. Virtually everybody went to those two schools. Howard was a Freedmen's Bureau school. There was free tuition. It was easy to get in, especially if you already had you were going to so well prepared academically as Lincoln's graduates were. I mean, Darnes has studied Latin and Greek and sciences and was as well prepared as any college student at that time to enter the medical department at Howard. Now, Howard was a co-educational, men and women, and it had a very diverse student population. While he was interning at the Freedmen's Bureau Hospital, a newspaper remarks that the honor and praise belongs to Dr. Darnes, who, like the good physician, watched and cared for Mr. Ottley. Now, Mr. Ottley was a Howard alumnus who was deathly ill and had been overlooked by one of the white doctors. And this newspaper article is complaining about the administration at the Freedmen's Bureau Hospital, but praises Dr. Darnes in that he stepped in and looked after Ottley. When he graduated in 1880, his class included 14 others, including one woman and a man from Canada. Now, while attending Howard, Darnes joins the Masons and becomes an officer in the Masonic fraternity. And this is something that is important for him for the rest of his life. He then moves back to Florida. And in 1880 sets up his medical practice in Jacksonville. This is his advertisement in the Jacksonville City Directory. And he was the childhood physician for James Weldon Johnson and his brother Rosamond, the men who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. James Weldon Johnson has just had a park named for him in downtown Jacksonville. And Johnson, in his autobiography, remarks, "When I was perhaps 10 years old, a strange being came to Jacksonville, the first colored doctor. He made a success, but it was a hard uphill fight." Many people in the African American community were a little suspicious that a black man could treat them as well as a white, especially when they saw him scribbling prescriptions in Latin, this mysterious text that would be handed over to the pharmacist that would provide them with medicine that meant the difference of life and death. And this is another photograph, one of two that we have of Dr. Darnes. And this one was taken in Jacksonville. The earlier one was taken at Lincoln University. And the Washington, D.C. newspaper reports that Dr. Darnes was located in a growing city and hung out his shingle. Furthermore, he enjoys a comparatively large and successful and lucrative practice. The skill and ability of the young doctor has already received applause and commendation by the white medical fraternity of Jacksonville. Now, in 1883, Darnes is doing so well, he builds a new house. And it was on Ocean Street, 117 Ocean Street. Now, the numbers are not the same today. But you can see here on a bird's eye view of St. Augustine, where the blue arrow is pointing, that was the substantial house. It had 10 rooms. It cost him $2,500. And living with him was his mother, Violet, and his nephew by his half-sister, Alexander H. Earl, his namesake. Now, the house was destroyed in the 1901 fire of Jacksonville. And here is Alex's half-sister, Lucinda, we think. Alex's great-nephew had the family photographs, which he graciously gave to me, the ones that had been Dr. Darnes's. And there's several pictures of this same woman. She bears a striking resemblance to the picture that we have of Violet. And so we think this is Lucinda Earle. Now, Dr. Darnes went through several medical emergencies in Jacksonville. First, it was the 1884 smallpox epidemic, but the really big one was the yellow fever epidemic of 1888. At that time, the entire city of Jacksonville was quarantined. Anybody who could fled the city, but if you were going to flee Jacksonville, you had to go in a holding camp up on the St. Mary's River and wait for 10 days to see whether you actually had the disease or not. And during the epidemic, which lasted for several months, in 1888, 427 persons out of a total of 4,704 cases were killed. Yellow fever, it was unknown how it was transmitted. All anybody knew was that it went away in cold weather. Little did they know that it was mosquitoes that bore the disease. And while that earlier newspaper article said that he was respected by the white medical fraternity in Jacksonville, by the 1940s, when a history of that epidemic was written, they're not so respectful. Darnes is mentioned just by name in one footnote in this book on the history of medicine in Jacksonville in regards to that epidemic, and he's not mentioned anywhere else in the book. There are other books about 19th century medicine, particularly Ashby Hammond's book in 1996, which makes no reference to Darnes. Now, Darnes was plainly visible. If you'd gone to the city directory in Jacksonville and looked under physicians, there he was. So one has to wonder why Alexander Darnes, like so many black men, became invisible during this Jim Crow era. And I don't know why that didn't switch. Anyway, now here are some more comments by Alex about General Smith. Whenever General Smith came to a place where I was, he always looked me up and would see me before he left. Now, Professor Edmund Purvey Smith and his daughter came to Jacksonville in 1890. So we think that they probably met up with Dr. Darnes, and it's at that time that Dr. Darnes is given this rather large presentation photograph of the general in old age, still wearing his Confederate uniform, and his comment on the back is, "With the esteem and affectionate regards of your old master and friend, E. Kirby Smith." They had an unusual relationship, to say the least. And Smith dies in 1883, and he writes several letters. Darnes writes several letters to Widow Smith that summer, and in one of these he comments that Smith, he was a generous, virtuous Christian gentleman and a brave soldier with the benevolent turn of mind and heart, and the heart of a nobleman. And that's his grave in Sewanee, Tennessee. Now, Darnes was a bit of an entrepreneur. He bought property in several portions of Jacksonville. Actually, he also bought lots in a new little African community not too far from Bayard in southern Duval County. But he also bought 2 oceanfront lots in Pablo Beach, which is now Jacksonville Beach. And he built and operated a bathhouse there. The bathhouse was actually operated during the summer months by his nephew, Alexander H. Earl. Oops. And here's one of the hotels at the beach at that time. And during the August 1893 hurricane, the people in the hotel evacuated the hotel and took refuge in the bathhouse. So I have a suspicion the bathhouse was concrete, and they thought it might have been a little safer during the hurricane. Now, I mentioned earlier that Darnes had joined the Masonic fraternity when he was living in Washington, D.C. Well, by 1893, the year before he died, after having served in multiple offices in the Grand Lodge of Florida. He was elected Deputy Grand Master. So the following year, he would have been leader of the entire Black Masonic fraternity in the state. That was 110 lodges. The Masonic Order was one of the largest black fraternities in the entire state at that time. So this was a very high honor, and you can see by a vote of 165 to 67, he won handily. Now, Darnes dies in February of 1893. And his funeral at Mount Zion AME Church in Jacksonville, and this is a picture of what the church looked like then. Of course, the church burned in the 1901 fire of Jacksonville, but this is from his obituary, that the deceased stood in high estimation of the people of this city, both white and colored, and was one of the most prominent colored Masons in America. Some 3,000 persons attended the servants, and the remains were carried to the cemetery. He's buried in Old City Cemetery, and there's his original headstone, which is inscribed, Dr. A.H. Darnes arrived in Jacksonville, Florida, October 1880, died February 9th, 1894. Now, after his death, there were tributes from him in the newspaper. He was the physician for Edward Waters College, and the students, faculty there wrote a resolution and published it in the paper, commending his services. It's also commented that he gave the first $25 to help establish the Florida Baptist Academy. Now, the Florida Baptist Academy has gone by several names over the years and moved 3 times. It's now headquartered in Miami and is Florida Memorial University. At one time, it was in St. Augustine. And then, sadly, about a year later, in 1895, Violet dies. And Darnes died without a will. So we're very lucky in that there's about 100 pages of probate record from John Wetmore, who was the executor of his estate. And so this is the actual bill for Violet's funeral. She was also buried in what's called Old City Cemetery, although she doesn't have a headstone. She's probably next to her son, but we don't know that for sure. Now, in 2009, the Kirby Smith camp of the Sons of Confederate Veterans replaced Dr. Darnes' damaged headstone, and his closest living relatives, the descendants of his nephew, Alexander Earl, approved this change. There were a number of Masons at the ceremony, and so there were full Masonic rituals provided, and I went to the ceremony. And this is what his current headstone says and looks like. And they changed the inscription. And they took the date of birth from the obituary, which, as I've mentioned earlier, is one of the least accurate ways of dating somebody's birth over 50 years later. So when I first started examining Dr. Darnes' career so that we knew that he was worthy of having a statue cast in bronze, in the garden of the Historical Society. Nobody knew anything about him. I found enough information to convince our Board of Trustees that the statue was appropriate, and then I started researching this man more and more, and as the internet has provided us with more detail that we can get to, whether it's newspaper databases or the historically black University and Colleges Archives database that has provided me with so much information that in 2003 we did not have. So this rediscovery of his life was an evolution. As I said, it culminated in the, here's a close-up of the statue. It culminated in the Florida Historical Quarterly article. So that is now available online, and there's the URL for it. It's the winter 2016 issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly, and I was very pleased to get an award from the Florida Historical Society as the best article in the Florida Historical Quarterly for that year. But as I said, it's been a rediscovery of a man who was, whose memory was largely wiped out, except a couple of his family members are still named after him. There are Alexander Earls today walking around in Jacksonville. And, but everybody else had pretty much forgotten him. On the Smith side, one of Smith's children, the last surviving one, who published Cassandra Smith's All's Fair in Love and War booklet, in 1937, she put a little article in the St. Augustine Record asking if anybody knew anything about Alec. And she knew he had become a physician, because that's mentioned in the, her mother's little account, but she didn't know his last name. She had an idea it was Alexander Means. So his memory had been lost to the Kirby Smith family. So there are many other people like this whose memory have been lost that deserve a re-examination. And hopefully I'll find one as good as Dr. Darnes to examine sometime in the near future. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I hope you've enjoyed this program. Thank you very much for your attention.